This evening, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by a friend and very experienced diplomat, John Wilks. John is the UK's representative for Syria, who is uniquely qualified to talk to us about the appalling situation in that country as it tears itself apart, and who will focus on drawing the link between the unfolding events in the Ukraine and the Crimea, where the common party is Russia, under its president, Vladimir Putin. John will speak to us and afterwards be glad to take questions. But at that point, he'll be joined on a panel by Professor Thomas Pierret, lecturer in contemporary Islam at the university, who is very knowledgeable about Syria, and Nick Williams, who has lived in and written about Kiev and the Ukraine. And at the conclusion of this event, there'll be a reception kindly hosted again by the Business School in the foyer outside. John Wilks has had an exceptionally successful and interesting career as a diplomat and is an experienced Arabist. He assumed his present role with Syria in April 2012 after 2 years as the UK's ambassador to Yemen. Other men might have expected a rather softer assignment after Yemen, but he didn't get it. With a BA and MA from the University of Durham, he subsequently gained an MPhil in International Relations and Affairs at Oxford. With the Foreign Office, he started his career there in 1989, working initially as Assistant Desk Officer for Iran in the Middle East Department, before moving in 1991 to London and Cairo for full-time Arabic language training. From 1993 to 1996, he was in Khartoum as the Second Secretary, Political and Press and Public Affairs, and from there moved to Riyadh as First Secretary, Economic. He then took some time off for further study, and from 2002 to 3 was on secondment to the Cabinet Office as an Iraq analyst and on the assessment staff. In 2003, he was in Baghdad as Deputy Head of the British Office there, and from 2004 to 5 was with the Foreign Office as Deputy Head Political of the Iraq Group. From there, he moved to be Deputy Head of Security Policy Group, and then to Dubai with the British government's Arabic spokesperson, and then from 2009 to July 2010 was in Baghdad as Deputy Head of Mission. And it was from Baghdad that he went to Yemen. I'm pleased to say that he came here from Shrivenham, but he is going to Istanbul tomorrow morning. And so on your behalf, I would like to thank John Wilks for joining us with this very, very interesting subject tonight. John, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here to talk about Syria and Ukraine. Now, as Roddy's explained, for the last 2 years, I've been the British government's ambassadorial envoy on Syria. I haven't actually gone into Syria because of the security situation there. We closed our embassy about 2 years ago. But I spent a lot of my time, about half the time in Turkey, Istanbul and down on the Turkish border, and about a quarter of my time in the Arab world, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, the Gulf, and then a quarter of my time back in the UK. So I'm going to talk about Syria from the perspective of somebody who's been at the coalface in the front line, trying to manage that crisis. And of course, all the indicators are pretty bad, as you will know. And so I want to explain a little bit about, no matter how gloomy the prospects, what we're trying to do to make things better. But like all ambassadors all over the world, we are getting asked about Ukraine. This is a crisis which has appeared, maybe not completely as a surprise, but certainly its timing, I think, was pretty unpredictable. There is a lot at stake. There is a read across to the Syria crisis. These are the two most acute crises, I think, that face this country and Europe and the West. And so I'd be very happy to talk a little bit about that as well, and to give you some idea of the policy decisions for British politicians, European, Western politicians, and where we go from here. Now, a lot of people ask me, and ever since I joined the diplomatic service in 1989, a lot of people have asked me very often in a pub, you're a diplomat, what do you do? And it actually is, it's not simple to explain what diplomats do, and you can lose people's attention very quickly unless you can get to the heart of the issues which are in the newspapers or on television. So actually tonight, without me focusing just on the issue of what diplomats do, I think you will get to understand what diplomats are doing on Ukraine, what I specifically with my teams are doing on Syria, which should give you a very good example of one big area of work for diplomats, and that is conflict resolution. Dealing with crises, trying to prevent them escalating, trying to avoid war, trying to bring stability and stabilization to countries that are going through conflict. It is not an easy task, and Syria is possibly the most difficult conflict I've had to deal with, more difficult even than Iraq and Yemen, which are the two previous conflicts I'd been involved with. And because we're here in a business school, I remember one training course I did at a business school where I was introduced to the concept of the wicked problem. This is a very good example in international affairs of a wicked problem. There are no solutions, but what we have to do is try and manage events, chance events, to turn this into a slightly less wicked and more difficult problem, and then ultimately a problem with a solution. The problem is with events, of course, they sometimes are beneficial and they sometimes set you back. And if you like, the event that broke a couple of weeks ago, this crisis with the Ukraine, has really set us back on Syria. I'm sorry to say. It's made the problem even more wicked, if you like. And the reason is this. We managed to get the conflict in Syria has been going on for about 2.5 years. The protests, the revolution, as the opposition would see it, started about 3 years ago. So we've just passed the third anniversary of the first protests in Syria. We finally, I'll talk a little bit about how the conflict has gone and the major issues for the UK and for other countries who are involved. But we finally got the regime and part of the opposition around a negotiating table in Geneva in January and February for 2 weeks of negotiations, and I was there for that, moving from my usual haunts in the region to head the British team in Geneva. The prospects were extremely slim, but at least we got the sides talking, and the very expert UN envoy, Lakhdar Brahimi, managed, despite all the difficulties, to get the big issues on the table without either side walking out, and to get an atmosphere of, it would be seen as a concession to the other side to be the side that walked out. So even though we weren't making progress, we knew they were in the room and we had some time to try and change the mentalities from war mentalities to something more flexible and open to political compromise. But at the end of the second week, Lakhdar Brahimi made clear in a press conference in Geneva that the thing that was really preventing progress is the regime was refusing to discuss power sharing. The military situation on the ground is incrementally and attritionally going in the favour of the regime. So they feel that it's in their interest to carry on the conflict. The opposition is not ready to surrender, so the war is set to continue. But without even talking about power sharing, Brahimi made absolutely clear we can't make any progress. Behind the scenes, he said to the Americans and the Russians, and this is the point I want to make about why this problem of dealing with the Syria crisis got even worse because of Ukraine. He said, look, if you two cannot work more closely and more effectively together to build some common understanding of what the political solution in Syria is going to look like, to improve the atmosphere and to both work together to put pressure on the two sides, supported by the UK, France, other countries, I basically can't see how we can continue this because it's not going to get anywhere. And the US and the Russia, there were a couple of meetings, but they went away back to their capitals, but back to Moscow and Washington to consider what could be done. And then this crisis appeared a couple of weeks ago, which has made it extremely difficult to build that common understanding. And as a result, it has made even more complicated our efforts to get a political solution. So that's the linkage. I'll just talk very briefly now about this Syria crisis. Why does it matter? Public opinion, and that may be represented widely in this room, has basically taken the attitude, it's not our problem. We should not get involved, certainly not militarily, but actually this is a conflict in which we will not be able to get involved and do any good. We should contain its effects. We should, of course, give humanitarian aid to suffering civilians, like most conflicts, most civil wars. The innocent civilians in between are paying the biggest price, even more than the armed groups that are fighting. And we leave it at that. Now, that has never been the position of the UK government and other governments, because a number of indicators are heading in a negative direction that actually mean we can't just try and contain the problem. First of all, there's the scale of the humanitarian suffering itself. This is the greatest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century, and the figures are they're quite mind-boggling. I mean, half the population is in need of humanitarian aid. A third of the population are refugees or displaced. These figures are increasing month on month and may even accelerate because the conflict is intensifying as we speak, and as I said, the prospects of a peaceful solution are receding. Britain has taken a lead, and we are the second largest donor of humanitarian aid. In the last year, we've given £600 million worth of humanitarian aid. That's British taxpayers funded humanitarian aid. Now, that's the biggest humanitarian campaign that we've ever been involved in. And of course, that has helped to lift some of the suffering, but it doesn't solve the crisis. And if this conflict goes on for years, can we sustain that? And we clearly have an obligation to help. Other countries do as well. But the UN is saying that its appeals, which are for billions of pounds from donors across the world, are not being fully funded. And there will ultimately be donor fatigue if this conflict goes on for years. So there's an urgency and a pressure from that humanitarian perspective. In hard security terms, Al-Qaeda has established itself in Syria. There are thousands of Muslims resident in the West, including in this country, who have travelled and come back, some of whom have been radicalised, and there are plans for terrorist attacks in European countries. This issue has not gone away, it's come back. There is a real prospect of a terrorist attack in Britain or other European countries in the months and years ahead. And this is something that is very much on the mind of all prime ministers, presidents, interior ministers, the Home Secretary in this country. And again, it gives this urgency to the need to bring this conflict to a close and to contain the threat of extremism and terrorism. More widely, there are other issues at stake here. The destabilization of the region. Lebanon is looking very fragile. Jordan, which actually has proven itself to be more resilient maybe than expected. Nevertheless, the refugee burden in Jordan is not something that can be sustained for years and years. And the conflict in Iraq has been exacerbated, and also in Turkey there is a terrorist threat. So there is a sense of urgency. There's no sense in London or Washington or Paris or any of the capitals of the world that, Hezbollah's killing Al-Qaeda, what's not to like, it's not our problem, let's just let it burn itself out, even if that takes 10 years. That is not the attitude at all. Nevertheless, and it surprised me, I'll be very honest, public opinion in this country, and as I said, you probably represent this in this room, there is no pressure on our politicians to do more than provide humanitarian aid and try our best for a political solution. We live obviously in the shadow of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Britain, we had the vote in Parliament in August about taking military action after the use of chemical weapons. That vote was very clearly against. And the Foreign Secretary has said to the Syrian opposition, who've asked us to arm the moderate Syrian opposition, if we had a vote in Parliament about that issue of actually providing weapons, we'd probably lose it by an even bigger margin. So it's not going to happen. Other countries are providing military support. Iran and Russia, in 2012, having given military support to the regime, doubled up in order to sustain the regime in power. On the other side, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, other countries are providing military support. So this conflict is being fueled. And as I said, the indicators, humanitarian, regional destabilization and terrorism and extremism are all getting worse. So I don't see policy dramatically changing for us or for other countries. The counterterrorism crowd, to share with you the sort of debate that happened, said, well, we'd just like to challenge, British policy on this, and the discussion was had in other Western countries as well. Should we actually back Assad? Should we just say, we've got to deal with this terrorism threat? Let's not support the popular revolts or the moderate opposition. Let's radically change policy. I don't believe that argument ever stacked up, and indeed the consensus now is that Assad is really part of the problem and that we cannot see either the prospect of a political solution or dealing with this terrorist and extremist threat while he still remains. And there are four reasons for this, really. One is, going back to Iraq, Assad was fully supportive of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which of course was attacking American, to a certain extent, coalition troops. And the networks that are now in Syria are related, very often same people, to those that were in Iraq about 7 or 10 years ago. So he's got a relationship of convenience. Like Saddam Hussein in 2002, as these protests in Syria gathered pace about 2 years ago, he actually released a lot of Islamic militants onto the streets in order to create a security problem that he could say, it's either me or the extremists and you ought to back me. That's part of the political strategy of the regime, and their propaganda is focused on that. There are only two choices, it's us or al-Qaeda, and it's up to the moderate opposition to show there is a third choice. He's also in a relationship of convenience with al-Qaeda because in 2012, the regime decided it couldn't afford to spread its military forces around the country. It would let the north and the east go and focus on its homeland areas, the capital city and the areas in between. So the Alawite heartlands in the northwest of Syria, Damascus, the capital, and Homs province in between. And it would let al-Qaeda essentially establish itself in the areas in the north and the east, which is what happened. And you can see a relationship of convenience that if the moderate armed opposition move into an area, the regime starts bombing it. If al-Qaeda moves into an area, the regime stops. So there is, very much here, and you can say, well, welcome to the Middle East. I mean, this is, we all know that my enemy is my friend in the setting of the Middle East. But as a result, and this is a really important conclusion that policymakers have made, Assad is seen as part of the problem in dealing with al-Qaeda, not the solution, despite the fact his propaganda is, I am the sword and the shield, and the West will eventually come around seeing that I am the only person who can deal with that problem. So a lot of the work that I do in Turkey and in Jordan is to try and build the capability of the moderate opposition. Most Syrians don't want an Islamic state, they want an end to the war, and they want to live pretty much in an atmosphere where all the communities of Syria can participate in a political system. Syria, like Iraq and like Lebanon, has numerous communities, different ethnicities, different sects. It's a mosaic society, but most Syrians are moderates and they don't support an ideology that would impose an Islamic state. Most Syrians are Sunni Muslims, but most Syrians are also moderate, and a large number of them are secular. So the task for the moderate opposition, supported by us and others, is to connect with that majority, silent majority, the sort of centre of Syrian opinion that's neither on the side of the regime nor the formal opposition. They've made some progress in 2 years, but nowhere near enough. And one of the questions I regularly get when I do talks like this is, who is this opposition? Aren't they all a bunch of extremists? Are they completely unreliable? Do they represent anything on the ground, the people you deal with in Turkey or Jordan? My argument would be is they've got a serious challenge here to connect the opposition that does exist on the ground with the opposition externally and to bring the military and civilian wings together. And maybe we can talk a little bit later about what we're doing and how we can improve that situation. Let me move now on to Ukraine and what's at stake there. As I said, it's really set back the search for peace in Syria because our relationship with Russia now is right on a cliff edge. The UK has made absolutely clear in recent weeks that we regard what Russia has done as completely unacceptable. The attempt to organise that snap referendum in the Crimea was essentially the front for an act of aggression that broke the standards that we have tried to establish in that part of the world since the end of the Cold War in 1989. And as those of you who know about international law know, international law is not like domestic law where there are crimes which are tried and punished in all but a few cases. But essentially, in order to sustain the rules, if you like, you have to make sure that those who break the rules pay a price in some form. Now that's very difficult with Russia, which of course is a major nuclear power, and our politicians have made clear we're not going to war over this. But actually what Russia has done and what it might do next could undermine the system we've tried to establish in Central and Eastern Europe to the extent that we would have to take very serious measures indeed. And this discussion will continue tomorrow in Brussels, where there is a European Council, the heads of state and heads of government of European member states will discuss the response to what has just happened. Now, here's a good example of what diplomats do. Clearly, all the different European countries have different interests. Germany is very dependent on Russian gas. Some countries take the attitude that, look, Russia is a great power. It's proving that by doing what it's doing, and we can't really do much about it. We're not going to war. We must just accept it. We must appease. It's very often the case that we overuse the metaphor of Munich, but actually this is a remarkable parallel. What Adolf Hitler did to Czechoslovakia in 1938 is extremely similar to what Putin is doing. I don't want to make a parallel between Putin and Adolf Hitler and what his ultimate aims are, but I do want to make clear that there is a question here of where does this stop? You know, there's the rest of Ukraine to think about, and the UK has taken a very clear position that we will defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine by making Russia pay a price unless it reverses what it has done and establishes a constitutional process for dealing with the future of Crimea. Clearly here in Scotland, the way the referendum on independence is being conducted is constitutional and done with the agreement of the state in which the referendum is taking place. That was completely the opposite of what happened in the Crimea, where Ukraine had no say in this. It was just done and was defended in a way where black was called white. The sort of propaganda that is just pure power politics, that is saying we can call black white because we have the power to do so. This should remind, I think, all of us in Europe that we live in a very bad neighbourhood. It was very simple, I think, from 1989 and the end of the Cold War, for the last 25 years, to believe that we were just turning into a big Switzerland, basically, that we were all going to live secure, prosperous lives. And this way of thinking of power politics, of spheres of influence, of the use of force or the threat of the use of force in diplomacy was somehow something we all left behind. And you're all, I'm sure, seeing on television and in the media the debate about the cause of the First World War 100 years ago. One of the things that strikes me is that Russia and Putin still think like we all thought 100 years ago, and we have moved on. And what's at stake here is how far a rules-based system is going to extend in Europe. There are other things at stake here, and that is particularly the case for the UK. In 1994, we signed with the US and Russia essentially a treaty that said in return for Ukraine giving up its share of the former Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, that we would guarantee that there would be no aggression, no change in the territorial status and the boundaries of Ukraine. That's just happened. Now, there's a wider issue there. A lot of countries around the world that are trying to get nuclear weapons or thinking about getting nuclear weapons could see, if Russia gets away with this, that you are vulnerable if you don't have nuclear weapons. Ukraine gives them up. It gets some guarantees. What are they worth if the US and the UK and other countries don't do anything? So there's that wider issue there about nuclear proliferation and countries that are on the threshold of getting nuclear weapons. This is going to affect their calculations. There's a wider point as well about the credibility of the West. President Obama, in general, has made clear, and this is welcome in, I think, American public opinion, that we're not getting involved in wars in the Middle East particularly, but also we're going to share the burden with other Western countries in dealing with the various crises around the world. The danger is, though, that if you establish certain red lines or say this is unacceptable and you don't follow it through with diplomacy backed by the threat of the use of force, you can just look weak, and it can encourage others who are willing to use force or threaten to use force to take advantage. I'm not going to draw a parallel between what's happened in Syria and the effect that that has had on Putin, because I think he actually responded to something which surprised us all, which is the popular overthrow of President Yanukovych in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. But it's the way Putin now is thinking about Russia as a power and where its sphere of influence stops and its relationship with the future of the European Union. The issues that are at stake here are really about, are we entering a new era of our own history, where we actually lose the opportunity of creating, if you like, a rules-based space with Russia, Europe, everything in Central and Eastern Europe, which is what we've aimed for since the end of the Cold War in 1989. Do we have to accept now that we are going to live in a sort of new Cold War with Russia? That's what is at stake. We don't want that. We want to de-escalate. We want to defend international law, defend Ukraine's rights, defend that treaty of 1994, and to continue to work with Russia on a number of issues. Syria, I've just explained how important that is, but it's also important on the Iran nuclear file. So there is a hell of a lot at stake here, and we can debate some of the issues later on. For Ukraine, I think also we have an obligation to support Ukraine's economy. It is vulnerable clearly to Russian threats and use of force, and it is in our interests and the interests, I think, of Western countries now to engage in a sustained program of support to get Ukraine's economies and institutions strong, and to show that if Ukraine chooses the constitutional and democratic path, that other democratic countries will respond seriously. It's not that we want a binary choice for Ukraine between Russia or the European Union. Ukraine will have to have excellent relations with both. But Ukraine is making a big choice to go down a constitutional and democratic route, and the UK feels there is an obligation on the rest of us to support that. I'll finish by saying the two great crises that face our country and the leaders of the world, Syria and Ukraine, are crises that will probably define the politics of the next couple of decades. So the decisions that are being taken, and they're extremely complicated and finely balanced, in Brussels in the next couple of days, in the international meetings that are going to happen in the months ahead, will probably affect all the major crises and issues that we've been discussing tonight and which have been with us for several years. I'll finish by saying that in the Cold War, it was very clear there was one major threat, and all our strategies of all our countries was focused on dealing with that and preventing an outbreak of a nuclear war. the complexity of the world, and I joined the Foreign Office in 1989, as Roddy said, which was very clearly when we entered a new era. The threats and the crises became unpredictable, and international relations is an inherently unpredictable sphere. Even when we know that crises are brewing, it's very difficult to predict the timing of a crisis exploding. And so I think for the UK, we need, both in terms of our hard military power, our diplomatic power, and our soft power, and our economic power, we need to have maximum flexibility in how we use those instruments of power to manage crises that we probably can't predict during this period. So I hope I've explained the thinking. I've explained a little bit about the UK role, what I and my teams are doing on Syria, and we're going to debate afterwards with experts on Syria and Ukraine about how we try and de-escalate and resolve the conflicts with which we are faced. Thank you very much.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed for an extremely interesting talk. We thought we would start off now by asking the professor to lead off on his view from what he's heard in a short overview of Syria, and then we will look at the Ukraine, and then we will open it up to the floor.
Thank you very much. Maybe in order to allow to connect with the issue of Ukraine, I'll comment briefly on the behavior on Russia, on Syria. The ambassadors say that the crisis in Ukraine has made the situation even more difficult in terms of negotiating a political solution in Syria with Russia. But at the same time, I think that by the end of the Geneva talks, what it had, in my view, been always obvious, was even more obvious than in the past, which is that I think Russia has a very negative stance on Syria. And I'll try to explain why. I think Russia is stuck. I don't think Russia can agree to power sharing in Syria, because that would mean losing everything. I don't think. Well, they know, in my view, very well that the only side that can guarantee the continuation of their influence in Syria is Bashar al-Assad. I think once Bashar al-Assad is gone, there would be nothing left of Russian influence in Syria. And the reason is that they have, to put it simply, they have zero soft power in Syria. They may have some support among minorities, but you don't build influence in a country on minorities unless you engineer, territorial fragmentation on that basis. But basically Russia made a choice early on when the uprising began. They thought Assad would be able to crush it. When the uprising militarized, they thought Assad could be able to do what they did in Chechnya, basically carpet bomb the country and rebuild some kind of power over it. I suspect they encouraged Assad to do that in 2012, use massive firepower, destroy entire cities to get rid of the insurgents. It failed, and I think now they're stuck in a position where basically they could not expect to retain any significant influence under an elected regime. And I hear very often from diplomats that, of course, it's off the record, but it's pretty clear for Russian diplomats. I mean, they don't want an elected regime in Syria, and they phrase it as, "We don't want a Sunni regime in Syria," but Syria is 80% Sunni. So what do you want? If you have an elected regime, it will be a Sunni one, at least Sunni dominated. And I basically think they want to keep things as they are. And that doesn't make me very optimistic about a possible change in the behavior, even regardless of the crisis in the Ukraine, which is of course making things even worse.
In my opinion, everything goes back to history and how people treat each other over the years. now Kievan Rus, I don't know if people have heard of this, but it was establishment or by more than 1,000 years ago, based in Kiev, but it moved further north into Russia as temperatures changed, as threats became more apparent from areas further south. So we can look at 1,000 years of interaction between Russians and Ukrainians. So that's a scene going backwards, but more recently we've had the Soviet Union, and there's a lot that happened in those 1,000 years, and a lot that happened, say, in the last 100. In 1954, to set the scene about what has happened in Crimea recently, which has fallen straight on the foot of the Maidan and all the bloodthirstiness on the square. But the Crimea was given by Khrushchev in 1954 to Ukraine. Some say that he was drunk at the time. It's not being corroborated, of course. In 1991, when there was the vote for independence for Ukraine, 1st of December, there was this was a referendum carried out across every oblast in the Ukraine, and the Crimea was stood out in the way that it voted, and it had the lowest turnout by about 10%, and 40% of the people voted no, as in they didn't want to secede from Ukraine. So there's a distinctive portion of Ukraine which you could say internationally that it should be Russian. Okay, so these are opinions, and there's also a large Tatar minority, Muslim, 12%. By the way, if you haven't been to Crimea, it's probably a bit late at the moment, but it's a wonderful place, and if I was trying to secede a country, then that's the one that I would choose, because it's got a wonderful landscape. It's a Riviera without the people. Imagine that. Now, I talked about history, and I think that's one of the most important things. And whether it's Syria and the complexities of the ethnic minorities and divisions which were created often by the West and more recently by more local players, there's always people who are disappointed with what they could have got and didn't get. And memory lasts long. In the Ukraine, of course, it's not just Russian and Ukrainian people who live there, and it's of course the BBC and other news outlets make it a bit simple for us to absorb in sound bites, but it's not that simple, because those who have lived in the west of Ukraine, in towns like Lvov and Ternopil and Ivano-Frankivsk, these are very Ukrainian-based towns. They vote for Ukrainians. There's more Ukrainians by ethnicity there. Ukrainian is spoken. In the Far East, it's slightly different, with much more Russian population. Russians have been brought in, come in over the years. There's also a different history of persecution. So there's the Great Famine, which affected those on the west, and there's the sending to gulags in the 1940s by those living in the east. I mean, okay, I'm generalizing, but their memories last long, and these kind of things pop up when people are told to go to the referendum again. A third point is about the failed promises and expectations that people have when they set up something. So it's true to say that the government in Ukraine has failed the people, and that's why you have successive revolutions. You had Orange Revolution, 2004-05, and the most recent one in the Maidan. And this is in the middle of winter, and it's -20. That doesn't happen in London. They always pick nice summer nights. So there's less to lose. And I suppose I also wanted to look at sort of the different stakes that other players have, whether this is Europe or the US. And the ambassador talks about how important this is for us, but it's us is sort of needs to be qualified. The US has possibly a different agenda. The Germans have a much stronger agenda. They're very heavily linked with the gas. There's also big corporations like Siemens who have big contracts in Ukraine. There's a lot to lose. So I suppose there's those points is the history, the current complexity and the geography, and also the failed expectations.
Thank you, Nick.
I'm Will Clegg from the Asia Scotland Institute. I wanted to ask two short questions that maybe don't have short answers. The first is, are we witnessing another very torturous part of Russia's imperial decline, or is Russia starting to reascend? Is this a Russian neo-imperialism that we're witnessing around the world, in Syria and Ukraine, etc.? Secondly, looking east from Syria and Crimea, how does all of this impact on Asia? What are the Asians saying about the annexation of Crimea, about the disruption in Syria, about the options for intervention, and what does this tell us about the future of the Asia-Pacific? Thank you.
And he's from Australasia, right?
Yeah.
Lady here.
Anne Packard. As the daughter of a late diplomat, Your Excellency, I appreciate the truly sobering picture that you have painted. And it's very important for us, I think, to hear it firsthand, so thank you. You referred to the issue of Al-Qaeda, which quite rightly is something that is most unfortunate. However, do you actually think that irrespective of the resolution and solutions which must come for the peace of the world, that in fact it won't go on sprouting hither and yon, a bit like mushroom spores? And I'd be interested in your view of that.
2 rows back, gentleman there.
Hello, I'm Yao. I'm from China, and I'm a PhD student in the business school of Edinburgh University. And I have a question about the Syria crisis. My question is, there's sufficient evidence showing that there are several jihadist and terrorism groups have been evolving in this Syria civil war, and one of which is the notorious Eastern Turkestan movement terrorist, which is responsible for the recent terrorism attack in the southern China. And my question is, why these Western countries support the rebellion of the Syria crisis, and does it indicate that the West would rather support the jihad, extremism or terrorism instead of a dictatorship?
Thank you very much. Let's take those 3 questions then.
Yeah.
Other gentlemen? Right.
Good questions. Shall I kick off?
Why don't you kick off?
Yeah. Okay. That's
Yep.
working, isn't it? Yeah. So I think there were 4 questions actually, because
Yeah, there were
you got 2.
He's also from Balliol, so you expect that.
They're all good questions. Is Russia on the up or on the way down? I'm not a Russia expert, but I think it is really important to raise this issue. Putin in the short term, he appeared before the houses of the Russian parliament yesterday, and clearly has got a short-term boost out of this. But in fact, Russia's economy is more connected, more open, and therefore more vulnerable to sanctions. And I think it has to be debatable whether actually Russia in the long term is going to get away with this economically. We don't even need to consider war. And that's why I think there's a lot at stake in the diplomacy in the European Union and in the West in general about how we manage the economic and financial sanctions that we could impose, because there will be a short-term price that we will all have to pay in our economies as well if we go along that route, and different countries will judge their interests in different ways. But I think all I'd like to say is let us not assume that this is Russia on the way back, that there's nothing we can do about it, that Putin has made a great strategic move here. I think the evidence at the moment suggests that he might well have just reacted very quickly to the surprise disappearance of President Yanukovych, and he's taken a big risk, and he might yet lose out. The impact on Asia, I'd actually like to specifically talk about how China's reacted to this, which I think is the most significant element. China, in principle, always backs territorial integrity and non-interference in state affairs. Russia has blatantly just gone and interfered in another state's affairs. So, in principle, China cannot support this. But in balance of power terms, China doesn't want to have a crisis in its relationship with Russia, and will probably not directly and clearly criticize Russia. And therefore, China has taken quite an ambiguous position. We all tried to pass a UN Security Council resolution a couple of days ago condemning what Russia had done, expecting a Russian veto. China abstained. So Russia was isolated, but China took an ambiguous position. And I think, China, it will be a dilemma for China if Russia doesn't reverse to a certain extent what it has done. And I think that goes for a lot of other countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, the BRICS, which Russia will no doubt be attempting to bring onto its side of this debate. Japan also has taken an ambiguous position because of its energy relationships with Russia. So part of the complexity of the diplomacy is to aim for an outcome that can isolate Russia and gain maximum support in the international community. So while Europe has specific interests, we actually have to try and build a wide consensus. On Al-Qaeda, will it just continue to sprout wherever there is conflict and failed states? I think the answer is yes. And we need to look carefully at the reasons why states fail in the modern world. Because we're seeing this in Africa, in Mali and Central African Republic, we're seeing it in Somalia. I was in Yemen, which was clearly a case of state failure. We've seen it in Afghanistan. And while we might all come to the conclusion, well, there's very little we can do in terms of direct intervention after Iraq and Afghanistan, in fact, a very interesting report was issued by the RAND Corporation recently, which said if you take Iraq and Afghanistan out of the equation and just look at where the international community has intervened in some way to sustain a peace settlement. So in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was no peace settlement. These were direct interventions without a peace agreement. Actually, the statistics show since the Cold War, there have been about 20 or 30 interventions in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And in fact, on balance, they've been quite successful in terms of making some progress on stabilization, some progress on developing the economy, that we shouldn't wring our hands in despair and just say, pull up the drawbridge. We cannot do any good in these parts of the world. We just have to keep the terrorism and the migration and all the problems that come with failed states away. We actually know what works and what doesn't work, and I think we need to have a certain level of, if you like, prudent confidence that we can do some good, but we need to get basic peace agreements between warring parties that we can then support. And I'd just like to draw something out from trying to answer that question. I think there is a link between Syria and Ukraine and Russia, and it's really important underlying issue. We're talking here underlying the conflict in Syria. It's also a problem in Ukraine, and it could be in Russia, and I think Vladimir Putin really fears this, is a crisis of the state to deliver for its citizens. We need to look at why states fail. We need to look at why states that are still stable, they're not yet failing states, why their leaders fear popular revolt. What is it that the pressure cooker, they're afraid that the pressure cooker will blow? If we look at the Arab Spring 3 years ago, although the Arab Spring has not developed into any great success stories yet, there was clear popular demands for, you remember it all started off with that young guy in Tunisia who just self-immolated. It was about things like economic opportunity. It was about being treated with dignity. It was about just basically citizens' rights. This was also the demand of a lot of the protesters in Syria. Bashar al-Assad's regime effectively decided to crack down with a high level of force and give the message, you obey or you die. Now, the problem with doing that is if enough people say, well, we're not obeying and we are willing to lay down our lives, you've played your last card, haven't you? It's very difficult to go back from that. And I think Putin, doesn't want popular rebellions to work because ultimately he fears he'll have one himself, that he could have a crisis of the state. I think that's the underlying issue that we're dealing with here. And there's another issue as well, which links what we're dealing with in regional terms in the Middle East, and that is oil. If we look at what Russia is doing, it can do it because it's got oil wealth. If we look at what Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar are doing, it's because of their oil wealth. States can, if you like, liberate themselves from public opinion and engage in adventures, even if their public opinion is quite angry about economic issues and civil rights and things. It's part of what's called the oil curse. And so ultimately, if we're going to move international affairs and the way the world works into a better space, I think we're going to have to look at diversification of energy sources so that we don't have states which are able to engage in these sorts of adventures because they have no link between their public opinions and their elites. And then the fourth issue, why do Western countries support popular rebellions? It comes back to this idea of why states are failing and state crises. It is true the West does not have faith in authoritarian models of development, although we can see that in China and in other countries, for certain stages of the development of those countries, that has been successful for a time. So when we see popular rebellions over legitimate demands, we are inherently sympathetic, even if we understand that these transitions are complex and that it is incredibly difficult, particularly when you move from, really, I call it sort of pure fascism, if you like, in Syria and Iraq under Saddam, where you have security states that really don't rely on legitimate consent. They really are based on force and threats and coercion. It is very difficult to enter a transition when a popular rebellion starts, as is the case in Syria, and the use of force doesn't scare people. You can't kill enough people, you can't exile enough people, you can't terrorize or torture enough people to stop the rebellion. So I think, it's two things. It's an understanding that public opinion has to have an influence on the way political leaders develop their economies, but also a lack of faith in authoritarian models of development in the modern world. And we see that there are exceptions, but I don't see Cuba or North Korea as the way to go for most countries in the world.
I'm looking at the clock sort of through the side of my eye, and I know that there's a bar waiting to be visited. If there's one brave person who wants to ask one more question, stick your hand up. There. A lady here. 1, 2, 3 rows back. There we go. Please say who you are and a question, please.
I'm Margot Alexander, Scotland Russia Forum. It interests me that since the conflict is moved and centred now in Crimea, that the street demonstrations have come to a sudden closure. I was just wondering if there's any evidence that Russia was orchestrating this recent revolution in Ukraine in order to cause instability in the area, so that it gave them an opportunity to step in, sort of thing.
We're going to take that question. I would just say to you that there's plenty of opportunity, because the ambassador's not going anywhere except outside, to asking questions there, so I do apologise. Yeah.
Just if I could ask a more open.
All right, okay.
Sorry.
Last one.
Sorry. Ed Thompson from the Asia Scotland Institute. I was just wondering that there are parallels between the situation we have now and 2008 with Georgia, both in terms of the direct Russian intervention in a neighboring country, but also at the time wider geopolitical considerations in the Middle East with relation to Iran and other countries and so on. There are differences as well, but to what extent do you see that there might be some parallel where the initial indignation that we're feeling now might simply fade away within the next year or two? What's different about the situation now compared to previous crises?
Certainly. Thanks for the question. The Georgian crisis 2008, very similar to the one of 1993 probably, where Russian intervention has been suspected, certainly in the work that went in Abkhazia as an internal conflict. I'd probably like to make a more general point about Russia and flexing its muscles, that hunting bears and finding amphoras on the Mediterranean looks really good in the press, but taking a peninsula from its neighbour is really good. I mean, that's about as good as it can get. So Putin, his ratings in Russia have really soared. You may wonder where he's going next. That was the first question we had over here. If there were going to be any places, then you could put possibly your money on some of East Ukraine, like Kharkov, less so Donetsk. And this is to do with, wealth of the place, how many factories there are, and also the public opinion that he will get. Possibly Baltic states, who were the first to secede in 1991, Estonia might be on the list. This is only conjecture, of course.
The question about, isn't this a bit like Georgia, and to what extent is it similar, and can we expect a similar result? I think there's just so much more at stake. Not just because Ukraine is bigger, it is because of the way it's happened. It is because of the proximity to European Union and NATO countries. It is because of this issue of Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons for political guarantees that this would not happen. So I think it's really gripped the attention, and it's just much more intense than Georgia in 2008. And I think to a certain extent as well, with Georgia, when it was resolved, and many people said Russia got away with it, they said it's going to happen again. And here we are the second time, and people are asking, where does this end? So I think, the if you like, the history has moved on, as well as it being a lot more at stake.
With regards to the first question of the last two, did they manipulate the events in Kiev?
Without doubt. I think, if you read the media, and we've got some very good journalists who've been reporting on this, you don't need to hear it from me. This has been very artificially created, and as I said, propaganda being used in a way that we haven't seen really since the end of the Cold War.
Professor, do you want to add anything?
Maybe just a quick comment regarding your question on Russian power. In the case of Syria, I think Russia looks strong because Western states are weak. If you think of the August crisis over chemical weapons, actually during these 10 days during which Western military intervention was expected, Russia was in the position where Western states are now regarding Crimea. I mean, the reaction of Russia was, this will be an error, which means basically when we don't like it, but we won't go at war over Syria. They were not ready, they're very rigid on their position, but they're not ready to go very far. At least they don't want to commit militarily to the defense of Assad. I think it's more an illusion of power than actual one.
Can I just end with a relatively positive note? All diplomats, when faced with crises,
This is back to what is diplomacy, right?
yeah, and very complex crises, and it all looks terribly gloomy. We just try to look at where are the common interests that would sustain effective diplomacy and break through some of the psychologies and move away from war psychologies to more flexible political compromises. Clearly, the growing presence and establishment of Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups in Syria is a clear common interest for Russia and China and America, France, Britain and other countries in the region. And because it's not going to go away while this conflict continues, that is probably the common interest on which we can start to base some diplomacy. And although Vladimir Putin, trying to think of his mentality, clearly doesn't want popular revolutions to succeed anywhere because he would see that as a threat to himself and his regime, he also is very focused on the threat of Islamic extremism anywhere in the world because of that threat coming back onto Russian territory. So he, nor we, nor even Iran ultimately, can sit for years with this sort of conflict and chaos and with extremists exploiting it. So that is, if you like, the one small sign of a common interest that allows us to sustain diplomacy through this incredibly complex time.
Thank you. Wow, what a very, very interesting panel. Thank you. Well, I think you've from a very complex situation, John and panelists, thank you also, you've brought through some extremely interesting thoughts and lines. So we're enormously grateful to you, to Nick Williams and to Professor Thomas Pierret. And we obviously hope that all of you will join us for future events, and we hope that we will continue to stimulate you with what we do. I just wanted to mention some things very quickly, because I'm bound to, aren't I? The next thing is on March the 26th, when David Clive Price is going to present first at the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation, and then subsequently here on March the 27th, his book, which is The Master Key to China. And it's an exceptional opportunity to learn about how to connect with China and do business there and acquire David's new book. These events will be followed by other talks elsewhere in Scotland, and in May we will start to launch a series of workshops designed not only for young professionals but also for people running small and medium-sized enterprises. In time, we hope to be able to engage with the C-suite or the leaders of bigger companies within Scotland itself. On the 14th of April in the evening, Dominic Barton, who is the global head of McKinsey & Company, will be here at the Business School as part of our Global Business Leaders series. Some of you heard Xavier Rollet, the Chief Executive of the London Stock Exchange Group, speak here a few weeks ago. There will be other ambassadorial events. I'm talking with the Embassy of Vietnam and Thailand about coming here at some point. And we're obviously in touch with India and China, and we will be looking at those. And amongst business leaders, the Chairman and Chief Executive and founders of Wipro, Infosys, and also Vikram Singh Mehta, who was the Chairman of Shell in India and is now the Chairman of the Brookings Institute in Asia, will be coming here. The Adam Smith series will continue shortly with some more global economic briefings. We'll be looking at book launches by scholars from Washington and from London, and we'll be launching some more cultural programs. And a date for your diary: in early July, we will, with the American Scottish Foundation in New York and the Chicago Scots in Chicago, be doing a global conference on the Scottish diaspora, reaching out to them to create a really strong and accurate network of those who think about Scotland around the world, which I hope will also open up channels for the distribution of products for people producing products here. So, if you're not a member, become one. So far, these events have been free. The portcullis will drop at some point, and if you're not a member, you're going to have to pay. But we really do value your support. This book will be available when David is here, David Clive Price. And once more, on your behalf, I would like to thank our panelists, all of them, and in particular, the Ambassador. John, thank you.